An ordinary night takes an unexpected turn when one small act of kindness sets off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What happens next will leave you speechless and questioning what you would do in the same situation. Stay with us until the end to witness a moment of courage that changes everything. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Chuck Norris adjusted his cowboy hat as he stepped out of his truck, stretching his arms after a long drive. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of pine and asphalt. A small roadside diner stood ahead, its neon sign flickering, struggling to stay lit. The warm glow from inside cast a welcoming light onto the pavement, where a few stray leaves rustled in the gentle breeze. The soft murmur of conversation and the faint clatter of plates and silverware promised a moment of peace after hours on the road. As he approached the entrance, something made him pause. His sharp gaze caught sight of a boy standing outside the diner, pressed up against the glass window. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old, with dark skin and wiry limbs that looked too thin for his frame. His clothes were worn, frayed at the edges, the faded fabric barely holding together. His sneakers had gaping holes at the toes, revealing the tips of his small, curled-up feet. But it wasn't just the state of his clothing that made Chuck stop. It was the way the boy stood. Shoulders hunched, weight shifting uneasily from one foot to the other. His large, wide-set eyes reflected the golden light from inside, filled with hunger and hesitation. He wasn't just looking at the food. He was staring at the people inside, watching them eat, as if he were trying to absorb the warmth from a distance. Chuck took a slow breath, stepping closer. The boy stiffened, his fingers gripping the edge of the window frame as if ready to bolt. Chuck kneeled slightly, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. "Hey there, partner," Chuck said, his voice calm, measured. "You hungry?" The boy blinked at him, startled. He hesitated before shifting his gaze downward, staring at his worn-out shoes. He said nothing at first, just standing there, as if waiting for Chuck to change his mind and walk away. "When was the last time you ate?" Chuck asked, keeping his tone gentle but firm. The boy hesitated again, shuffling his feet before mumbling, "2 days ago, just some bread." Chuck's chest tightened. He gave the boy a small, warm smile and tilted his head toward the diner's entrance. "Come on in," he said. "Let's fix that." For a moment, the boy didn't move. His dark eyes darted between Chuck and the door, as if trying to decide if this was real or some kind of trick. Then, cautiously, he nodded. Chuck straightened up and opened the door. The boy followed, moving carefully, like a stray animal unsure if it could trust the hand being offered. Inside, the diner was filled with the comforting aroma of sizzling burgers, fresh coffee, and crispy fries. The hum of quiet conversations and soft music from an old jukebox made the space feel warm and familiar. A few patrons glanced up as Chuck and the boy entered, but most quickly returned to their meals, uninterested in the new arrivals. Chuck led the boy to the counter, where a weary-looking cashier stood behind the register. She gave them a polite nod, wiping her hands on her apron. "Evening," she said. "What can I get you?" Chuck rested his hands on the counter. "One of your biggest burgers, large fries, and a soda." He glanced down at the boy. "That sound good to you?" The boy nodded, barely whispering, "Yes, thank you." The cashier gave Chuck a knowing look, one of quiet appreciation, before calling the order back to the kitchen. Within minutes, the tray was ready. Chuck picked it up and carried it to a booth in the corner, placing it in front of the boy, who sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "This is all yours," Chuck said, sliding the tray forward. The boy stared at the food, his fingers twitching slightly. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached out and picked up the burger. His small hands trembled as he lifted it to his lips, taking a tiny, careful bite. Then another. And another. Chuck leaned back in his seat, watching as the boy ate, his posture gradually relaxing. The tension in his shoulders eased, and for the first time his wary eyes showed something close to relief. Chuck didn't say anything. He just let the boy eat in peace. For a few moments, the world seemed to slow down. The low hum of the diner, the clink of silverware against plates, the distant sound of a truck rumbling down the highway, all of it blended into the background. But peace never lasted long. The sudden crash of the diner's door slamming open shattered the quiet. Chuck's instincts kicked in immediately. He turned his head slightly, his jaw tightening as 6 figures stomped inside, filling the room with the acrid stench of tobacco and engine grease. 6 bikers. They were dressed in worn leather jackets, adorned with patches and insignias. Their heavy boots thudded against the tiled floor, their laughter and crude jokes cutting through the diner's atmosphere like a knife. Chuck's relaxed demeanor didn't change, but his muscles tensed. He could read people well. And these men weren't just here for burgers. The leader of the group, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a tattoo of a skull creeping up his neck, was the first to spot Chuck and the boy. His expression twisted into a sneer. He nudged the man beside him, gesturing toward them. "Look what we got here," the leader said, his gravelly voice carrying through the room. "Chuck Norris feeding a street rat." Laughter erupted from the group. One of the bikers, a burly man with a thick beard, smirked and pointed at the boy. "What's this, Norris?" he jeered. "Your new charity project?" Another biker leaned against the counter, shaking his head mockingly. "What's next? You gonna adopt him?" The boy froze mid-bite. His hands trembled slightly as he tried to shrink into his seat. Chuck exhaled slowly, his jaw clenching. He placed his hands flat on the table and turned his gaze toward the leader. "He's just a kid," Chuck said, his voice steady. "Leave him alone." The leader tilted his head, his smirk widening. "A kid, huh?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "Nah, that's a stray. A beggar who doesn't belong in a place like this." Chuck stood slowly, his towering frame casting a shadow over the group. His movements were calm, controlled, but there was a weight behind them, a silent warning. "That's enough," Chuck said. "Move along." The bikers exchanged amused glances, chuckling under their breath. The leader stepped closer, standing chest to chest with Chuck. "And what if we don't?" the leader asked, his grin unwavering. "What are you gonna do about it, tough guy?" The tension in the diner thickened. The boy clutched the edge of the table, his small hands trembling. He didn't dare look up, but he could feel the shift in the air, the unspoken challenge hanging between the two men. Chuck's eyes didn't waver. His voice was calm, but beneath it was an edge of something dangerous. "I'll give you one last chance," Chuck said. "Walk away." The leader's smirk deepened as he turned to his men. "Should we teach him a lesson?" The bikers roared in agreement, stepping forward. And then it began. The atmosphere in the diner shifted the moment the bikers stepped closer. The air, once filled with the simple sounds of clinking dishes and quiet conversation, now felt thick with tension. The patrons, sensing trouble, either looked away or pretended to be absorbed in their meals. The waitress behind the counter hesitated, gripping the edge of the register, unsure if she should intervene or call for help. Chuck Norris stood tall, his expression calm but unwavering. The leader of the bikers, still smirking, took another step forward, deliberately invading Chuck's space. His companions fanned out slightly, positioning themselves in a loose semicircle. Their movements weren't random, they were calculated, predatory. Chuck didn't flinch. He had dealt with men like this before. Loud, overconfident, used to getting their way through intimidation. The boy, still seated at the booth, barely breathed. His wide eyes darted from Chuck to the bikers, his small hands clutching the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. The burger in front of him remained untouched now, forgotten in the growing sense of danger. The leader tilted his head, his smirk growing. "You know, Chuck, I always heard stories about you," he said, his voice carrying through the diner. "The big, bad Texas Ranger. The tough guy who never backs down. But I gotta say, feeding strays in a dump like this," he clicked his tongue, "kinda disappointing." Chuck's expression remained unreadable. He didn't respond, didn't move. One of the bikers, a man with a thick beard and a scar running down his left cheek, scoffed. "Maybe he's gone soft," he said. "Maybe the legend's just that, a legend." Another biker, younger, with a shaved head and a cocky grin, pointed at the boy. "Or maybe," he sneered, "he's just looking for a pet." Laughter rippled through the group. The boy shrank back further into the seat, his shoulders tensing. Chuck finally spoke, his voice low, steady. "He's just a kid," he said, "and he's eating his dinner. You got a problem with that?" The leader's grin didn't fade. "Yeah, I do." Without warning, he reached out and shoved the boy's tray off the table. The burger hit the floor with a wet slap, fries scattering across the tiles, soda spilling and spreading in a sticky mess. The diner fell silent. The boy gasped, his breath hitching, his fingers digging into his lap as if he was trying to disappear. Chuck's eyes darkened. His hands, still at his sides, curled into loose fists. The leader chuckled. "Oops," he said mockingly. "Looks like your dinner's ruined." The boy's chest rose and fell rapidly, but he didn't say a word. He just stared at the floor, his lip trembling, his small body visibly shaking. The bearded biker leaned forward, grinning. "Aw, what's the matter, kid? Cat got your tongue." Chuck exhaled slowly through his nose. He had given them a chance. He had tried to be civil, but there was a line, and these men had just crossed it. He turned his head slightly, locking eyes with the leader. "Pick it up," Chuck said. His voice was calm, too calm. The leader raised an eyebrow. "What?" Chuck didn't repeat himself. He simply stared. The unspoken challenge hung in the air like a storm cloud. The leader scoffed, glancing at his crew before looking back at Chuck. "Or what? You gonna make me?" Chuck took a slow step forward. The bikers tensed, their smirks faltering just slightly. "I said," Chuck repeated, his voice even lower, "pick it up." The leader's smirk twitched, the amusement in his eyes flickering. He glanced at his men again, and their laughter quieted. This was the moment where things would shift, where either fear would take hold or violence. For a brief second, it looked like the leader might back down. But then the younger biker with the shaved head, still full of bravado, stepped in between them. "You must be out of your damn mind," he said, looking Chuck up and down. "What, you think we're scared of you?" Chuck didn't answer. He simply watched. The young biker smirked, then suddenly grabbed Chuck's shirt, attempting to shove him back. He never got the chance. Chuck's hand moved like lightning, clamping onto the biker's wrist before twisting it sharply. The young man let out a choked yell as his arm was forced into a painful angle, his knees buckling. Before anyone else could react, Chuck used the biker's own momentum to slam him face first onto the counter. Dishes rattled. The waitress gasped. The young man crumpled to the ground, groaning. Silence. Then, chaos erupted. The bearded biker lunged first, throwing a wild punch. Chuck ducked effortlessly, then countered with a precise elbow strike to the man's ribs. The biker let out a pained grunt, stumbling back into another table. The leader, finally realizing this wasn't going to be easy, barked, "Get him!" 2 more bikers rushed Chuck at once. Chuck grabbed the first attacker by the arm, twisting and throwing him over his shoulder, sending him crashing onto the floor. The second one swung a chair. Chuck dodged, then sent a powerful front kick into the man's stomach, sending him sprawling backward. The diner erupted into shouts. Some customers ran for the exit. Others stayed, phones out, recording. The only one who didn't move was the boy. He just watched. The leader, now the last man standing, clenched his fists. His smirk was long gone. "You're going to regret that, old man," he growled. Chuck exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "You want a shot?" he asked. The leader didn't hesitate. He charged forward, swinging. Chuck sidestepped easily, then planted a palm into the leader's chest, shoving him backward with force. The biker stumbled but recovered fast, throwing another punch. This time, Chuck let him. The fist came straight toward his face, and in the last second, Chuck caught it mid-swing. The leader's eyes widened. Chuck's grip tightened around his knuckles. "You done?" Chuck asked. The leader grimaced, struggling. He tried to yank his hand free, but Chuck's grip was iron. "Ah!" The leader let out a strained noise. Chuck let go. The leader staggered backward, clutching his hand. He breathed hard, his confidence now completely shattered. He glared at Chuck, then at his men, most of whom were still on the floor, groaning. "You son of a—" Chuck took one step forward. The leader froze. Chuck tilted his head. "Pick it up." The leader swallowed. His face burned with humiliation. He hesitated, then slowly bent down and picked up the burger from the floor. He set it back on the table. Chuck nodded. "Now get out." For the first time that night, the leader didn't argue. He just turned sharply on his heel, barking at his men, "Move!" One by one, the bikers staggered toward the exit. The leader was the last to leave, his back stiff with anger and shame. The diner fell into silence again. Chuck turned to the boy. "You okay, kid?" The boy nodded slowly, but his hands still trembled slightly. Chuck looked at the ruined food, then back at the counter. "We'll get you another one." The boy hesitated, then nodded again. The waitress, still stunned, finally moved. "On the house," she said. The tension in the diner did not fade immediately. Even after the bikers had left, the air still felt heavy, charged with the echoes of what had just unfolded. The customers, who had stayed behind, murmured among themselves, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others glancing at Chuck Norris with wide eyes. A few still had their phones raised, having recorded the entire incident, though no one dared to approach him just yet. Chuck turned his attention back to the boy, who sat motionless in the booth. The kid's small hands still trembled slightly, though he was doing his best to hide it. His eyes flickered between Chuck and the ruined food on the table, as if unsure whether he should feel relieved or afraid. Chuck exhaled, then motioned toward the counter. "We'll get you another meal, kid," he said, his voice calm. The waitress, who had been standing stiffly behind the register, nodded quickly. "It's on the house," she said, hurrying towards the kitchen window to call in the order. The boy hesitated, then nodded slowly, shifting slightly in his seat but still glancing toward the door, as if half expecting the bikers to return. "They won't come back," Chuck assured him, lowering himself onto the seat across from the boy. His voice was steady, but not forceful. He could see the doubt in the kid's eyes, the learned instinct of someone who had spent too much time expecting the worst. For a long moment, the boy said nothing. He simply sat there, his fingers still curled tensely around the edges of the table. "You ever had someone stand up for you before?" Chuck asked. The boy finally met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, he shook his head. "No," he admitted quietly. Chuck nodded, not pressing the subject. He had seen that look before, the kind of guarded expression that only came from a kid who had spent too much time alone, fighting battles he was too young to fight. A moment later, the waitress returned, setting a fresh tray in front of the boy. A steaming burger, fries, and a new soda. The kid looked at it as if he wasn't sure it was real. "Go on," Chuck said, nodding toward the food. The boy hesitated, then slowly reached out and took a bite. Smaller this time, more careful. He ate silently, his shoulders slightly less tense now, though his eyes still flicked toward Chuck every few moments, as if trying to figure him out. Chuck didn't say anything at first. He let the kid eat, giving him space, knowing that trust wasn't something that could be forced. After a few minutes, the boy finally spoke. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quiet but curious. Chuck smirked slightly. "Just a guy passing through," he said. The boy studied him for a moment, chewing slowly before looking down at his plate again. "You knew them?" the boy asked after a moment. Chuck shook his head. "Didn't have to, I know their type." The boy frowned slightly. "You weren't scared of them?" Chuck shrugged. "Nothing to be scared of." The boy didn't look convinced. "They were big." Chuck leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Being big doesn't make you tough," he said simply. "Being mean doesn't either." The boy seemed to think about that. He took another bite, chewing more slowly now, as if he were still processing everything. The door to the diner opened again. This time, it wasn't bikers. It was a pair of local deputies, their uniforms crisp, their expressions wary as they scanned the room. Someone must have called them. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a thick mustache, approached the counter. "Got a report about a disturbance," he said to the waitress. "Something about a fight?" The waitress nodded, her eyes darting toward Chuck. "Yeah, it was handled," she said simply. The officer turned, finally noticing Chuck. His eyebrows lifted slightly in recognition. "Wait a minute," he said. "You're Chuck Norris." Chuck gave a slight nod but didn't say anything. The officer exhaled, glancing around at the diner, then back at the waitress. "Handled, huh?" The waitress nodded again. "Yep, the guys who started it ran off." The second deputy, a younger man with sharp eyes, scanned the room, his gaze lingering on the overturned chairs and the food still scattered on the floor. "You want to file a report?" he asked. The waitress shook her head. "No need. Got plenty of witnesses if they come back looking for trouble, though." The older officer hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "We'll do a sweep of the area, see if we find them." His gaze flickered to Chuck again. "You sure you don't want to give a statement?" Chuck shook his head. "Not necessary." The officer exhaled through his nose, clearly aware that pushing the issue wouldn't get him anywhere. "All right," he said, "but if they come back, let us know." With that, the officers turned and left. The moment they were gone, the tension in the diner seemed to ease just a bit more. The boy had stopped eating, watching the whole exchange carefully. He turned back to Chuck, his expression unreadable again. "They knew you," he said. Chuck smirked. Guess so. The boy was silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, he reached out and picked up a fry, eaten again, but this time the tension in his shoulders had eased just a little more. For the first time that night, he didn't look like he was waiting for something bad to happen. Chuck leaned back in his seat, watching as the boy finished his meal. He wasn't sure how long the kid had been alone, but one thing was clear. Tonight at least, he wouldn't have to be. The night outside the diner was still and quiet, but inside, the tension had not fully disappeared. Even after the police had left, Chuck remained seated across from the boy, watching him finish his meal. The kid's posture had relaxed slightly, though his eyes still carried a guarded look. He was used to being on his own, that much was clear. The weight of survival was something no child should have to carry, but Chuck had seen it before. He recognized the way the boy hunched his shoulders, the way his fingers twitched near his plate, as if expecting someone to take it away at any moment. Chuck waited until the last few fries had been eaten before speaking again. "You got a name, kid?" The boy hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Eli," he mumbled. Chuck nodded. "Eli, good name." He leaned back against the booth, crossing his arms. "You live around here?" Eli didn't answer right away. He pushed his empty plate aside and fidgeted with his fingers. "Not really," he admitted. "Just around." Chuck's jaw tightened slightly, though his expression remained calm. He had expected that answer. "How long?" he asked. Eli lifted his shoulders in another small shrug. "A while." Chuck studied him for a long moment, reading between the lines. The boy's clothes, the way he avoided specifics, the way he looked at the door every few minutes as if preparing to run. This wasn't just a rough patch. This kid had been alone for a long time. The waitress came by and cleared the table, glancing between them before giving Chuck a quiet nod. "That meal's covered," she said before walking off. Eli blinked as if surprised by the kindness. His fingers curled slightly, and for a moment he looked like he might say something. Instead, he just sat there, staring at the table. Chuck exhaled. "You got anywhere to go tonight?" Eli hesitated again, then shook his head. "I'll be fine," he said, but his voice was too quiet to be convincing. Chuck knew that tone. He had heard it before, from men who didn't want to admit they were in trouble, from people too proud to ask for help. "You been sleeping outside?" Chuck asked. Eli didn't answer, but his silence was confirmation enough. Chuck glanced toward the window, his sharp eyes scanning the parking lot. The cold outside was creeping in, and the kid had nothing but a thin hoodie and worn jeans. Sleeping in the open wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Eli must have sensed the shift in Chuck's demeanor because he suddenly straightened up, as if preparing to leave. "I should go," he muttered. Chuck reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a few folded bills. He slid them across the table. "Get yourself a motel room for the night," he said, "or some warmer clothes. Whatever you need." Eli's eyes widened slightly. He looked at the money, then up at Chuck. "I can't take that," he said, shaking his head. Chuck held his gaze. "You can," he said, "and you will." Eli hesitated, his small fingers hovering over the bills. "Why are you helping me?" he asked finally. Chuck leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Because someone should," he said simply. Eli swallowed, his fingers finally closing around the money. He gripped it tightly, as if afraid it might disappear. His eyes flickered with something that looked like gratitude, but also wariness. "You don't owe me anything," Chuck added. "Just take care of yourself." Eli nodded slowly, stuffing the money into his pocket. He looked at the door again, but this time there was no panic in his movements, just uncertainty. Chuck watched him carefully. He knew that even after tonight the kid's struggles weren't over. One meal and a few bucks wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. After a long moment, Eli stood up. "Thanks," he mumbled, barely above a whisper. Chuck gave him a small nod. "Stay safe, kid." Eli hesitated again, then turned and walked toward the exit. His steps were slow, as if he was still trying to decide if he was making the right choice. Chuck didn't watch him leave. He already knew he would see him again. The cold air hit Eli the moment he stepped outside, cutting through his thin hoodie like a blade. He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, clutching the money Chuck had given him as if it might vanish if he let go. The parking lot was mostly empty now, save for a few scattered vehicles and the distant hum of a passing truck on the highway. He stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the chilly night air, debating what to do next. Inside the diner, Chuck watched from his seat, his sharp eyes tracking the boy's every move. He had seen this before. The hesitation, the battle playing out inside a kid's head. Eli had probably spent years relying only on himself, learning not to trust anyone, surviving by keeping his distance. And now, for the first time in a long time, someone had helped him without asking for anything in return. That kind of thing didn't sit easy with kids like him. Eli took a step toward the road, then stopped. His shoulders tensed as if he'd come to a realization. Then he turned sharply and walked the opposite way, disappearing around the side of the diner. Chuck sighed, shaking his head slightly. He knew what the kid was doing. He wasn't going to a motel. He wasn't going to spend the money on new clothes. He was heading back to wherever he had been sleeping before, convincing himself that he didn't need help, that he was fine on his own. Chuck stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table for the waitress before heading for the door. Outside, the air was crisp and quiet, the distant neon glow of another roadside business flickering against the black sky. He moved toward the side of the diner, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. As expected, Eli was there, crouched behind a dumpster, rummaging through a small, worn-out backpack. Chuck approached slowly, making sure his steps were audible so he wouldn't startle the kid. Eli stiffened at the sound, his hands freezing mid-motion before he turned his head sharply. "You following me?" he asked, his voice defensive but not entirely surprised. Chuck stopped a few feet away, hands resting casually on his hips. "Didn't have to," he said. "Knew you weren't heading for a motel." Eli's jaw tightened, and he zipped up his backpack quickly. "I don't need a motel," he muttered. "I'm fine." Chuck exhaled through his nose, glancing around. The alley was dark, cluttered with trash bags and discarded boxes. It was no place for a kid to sleep. "That where you've been staying?" Chuck asked, nodding toward the small corner where Eli had set up a makeshift bed with a few tattered blankets and an old jacket. Eli shrugged. "It's dry," he said. "Could be worse." Chuck didn't argue. He knew that for a kid like Eli, worse was always an option. Instead, he leaned against the side of the building, watching the boy carefully. "How long you been on your own?" Eli hesitated, then looked away. "Long enough," he muttered. Chuck nodded, taking in the way the kid's fingers twitched slightly, the way he refused to meet his gaze for too long. Trust was a foreign concept to him, and Chuck wasn't going to force it, but he wasn't going to walk away either. "You think living like this makes you stronger?" Chuck asked after a moment. Eli frowned, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack. "I take care of myself," he said. "I don't need—" "Everyone needs help sometimes," Chuck interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Eli's mouth snapped shut. He stared at Chuck as if trying to figure out whether to believe him or not. Chuck sighed, running a hand over his beard before speaking again. "You got a choice here, kid," he said. "You can keep doing what you're doing. Keep convincing yourself you don't need anybody. Or," he paused, making sure Eli was listening, "or you can take a different road, one that doesn't end with you freezing behind a diner one night when the weather turns bad." Eli swallowed hard. For the first time, his posture wavered slightly. He wanted to argue, to push back, but something about Chuck's words stuck with him. Chuck straightened. "There's a place not far from here," he said, "a shelter. Good people run it. They'll make sure you got food, a warm bed, no strings attached." Eli shook his head quickly. "No shelters," he said. "I've been to those before. They don't care. Just another place where they throw you in a cot and forget about you." Chuck studied him, understanding in his eyes. "Not this one," he said simply. "I know the guy who runs it. Ex-Marine. He's not in the business of forgetting people." Eli hesitated, his fingers tightening around the straps of his backpack again. He wanted to say no. Chuck could see it, but there was something else too, something buried under all the fear and stubbornness. A sliver of doubt, a part of him that was tired of running, tired of being alone. "You don't have to decide now," Chuck said after a long pause, "but you think about it." He reached into his pocket again, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. He stepped forward and handed it to Eli, who took it hesitantly. "What's this?" Eli asked. "Address," Chuck said, "if you ever change your mind." Eli looked down at it, his brow furrowed. He turned it over between his fingers before slipping it into his pocket. Chuck took a step back. "Up to you, kid," he said. "But remember, being strong doesn't mean doing everything alone." Eli didn't say anything. He just watched as Chuck nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the parking lot. For a long time, Eli stood there, the address still pressed between his fingers. He looked down at it again, then at the dark alley around him, the cold settling deep in his bones. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure what to do next. Eli sat in the alley for a long time, his fingers wrapped around the small piece of paper Chuck had given him. The cold bit at his skin, and the wind whistled through the narrow space between the buildings, rattling loose pieces of debris. He stared at the address written in bold, steady handwriting. It was just an address, just an option. But somehow it felt heavier than that. His first instinct was to shove it deep into his pocket and forget about it. He had been fine on his own for this long. He didn't need some shelter, some ex-Marine looking after him like a lost cause. He could take care of himself. He always had. But then his stomach growled, a sharp reminder of how long it had been since his last real meal before tonight. And, despite the warm food Chuck had given him, the cold was already creeping back into his bones. Nights like this got dangerous fast. He let out a breath and stood, his decision made. If nothing else, he'd go see what the place looked like. If it felt wrong, he'd leave. He always had an escape plan. With stiff limbs, he hoisted his backpack onto his shoulders and stepped out of the alley, moving toward the main road. The highway stretched ahead, dark and seemingly endless, the occasional car speeding past. He looked back at the diner once, and its warm glow still visible through the window, then turned away and started walking. Chuck watched from the driver's seat of his truck. He had been parked a few spaces down, waiting. He wasn't going to force the kid to do anything, but he also wasn't going to let him disappear into the night without knowing he had a real choice. When he saw Eli finally make a decision and start walking in the direction of the address, Chuck exhaled slightly and put the truck into gear. He didn't drive ahead or call out. He just followed at a distance, making sure the kids stayed safe. Eli walked for nearly 30 minutes before he reached the building. It wasn't much from the outside, just a small brick shelter with a single porch light flickering above the door. A sign out front read Haven House in faded letters. It looked quiet, unassuming. There was no line of people waiting, no security guards at the entrance. Just a simple building standing against the cold night. Eli hesitated on the sidewalk, shifting from foot to foot. The weight of the decision pressed down on him again. Then the front door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a grizzled beard and eyes that immediately locked onto Eli. His stance was steady but not threatening, his presence commanding but not overbearing. He studied Eli for a moment, then nodded toward the door. "You coming in, or you just gonna stand there freezing?" Eli stiffened slightly, his fingers twitching at the straps of his backpack. "I don't know yet," he muttered. The man sighed and leaned against the doorframe. "Yeah, I get that." He folded his arms. "Name's Ray. I run this place. If you're looking for a bed, we got one. If you just want some food, that's fine too. No questions, no hassle." Eli eyed him warily. "What's the catch?" Ray huffed a short laugh. "No catch, kid. Just don't start trouble and don't take more than you need." He nodded toward the door again. "You don't have to stay, but it's warmer in here than out there." Eli hesitated, looking past Ray into the building. He could see the soft glow of the interior lights, the faint murmur of conversation. It wasn't crowded, just a few people here and there. It didn't feel like some of the shelters he had been in before, the ones where you were just another number in the system. He swallowed hard, then stepped forward. Ray didn't say anything else. He just held the door open and let Eli walk inside. Chuck watched from his truck as the door closed behind the kid. He waited another few minutes, making sure Eli didn't come back out, then nodded to himself. The kid had made the right choice. Without another word, Chuck shifted the truck into drive and pulled away, disappearing into the night. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of the small diner, casting long shadows across the empty tables. The place was quieter now, the chaos of the previous night nothing more than a memory. Outside, the highway stretched into the distance, the early traffic humming steadily. Chuck Norris parked his truck a few blocks away, stepping out and adjusting his hat. He had returned not for recognition, not for gratitude, but to make sure the boy was safe. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. He had seen too many kids like Eli slip through the cracks. He wasn't about to let that happen if he could help it. As he pushed open the door to the diner, a few lingering patrons glanced up, recognizing him from the previous night. Some nodded in quiet admiration. Others whispered among themselves, but Chuck ignored them. His eyes immediately scanned the booth where Eli had been sitting. It was empty. A small wave of worry surged through him, but before it could settle, the waitress from the night before approached him with a hesitant smile. "You're looking for the kid, aren't you?" she asked softly. Chuck nodded. "Did he leave last night?" She nodded, her expression a mix of sympathy and concern. "After you left, he looked unsure, like he didn't know what to do. He took the money you gave him and thanked me, but he seemed scared, like he's used to running." Chuck's jaw tightened. He had expected that. He thanked the waitress and stepped back outside, pulling out his phone. He had made a call last night to an old friend, someone he trusted to help. Now it was time to follow up. After a few rings, a voice answered on the other end. "Chuck," Ray's gruff voice greeted him. "I was wondering when you'd check in." Chuck got straight to the point. "Did he show?" A pause, then, "Yeah, he came in late, hesitated at the door for a while, but he stepped inside." Chuck exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening slightly. "How is he?" "Quiet," Ray admitted. "Doesn't talk much, but he ate, got a bed, didn't run out in the middle of the night, which is a good sign." Chuck nodded to himself, glancing toward the road. "He's got a shot, then." "Yeah," Ray said, "but it's up to him now. You did your part." Chuck was silent for a moment before he finally said, "Thanks, Ray." "Any time," Ray replied before hanging up. Chuck slid his phone back into his pocket. The sun had fully risen now, casting a golden glow over the city. He knew he might never see Eli again. The boy had his own road to walk, his own battles to fight, but he also knew that for the first time in a long time, Eli had a chance at something better. As he climbed back into his truck and pulled onto the highway, he let the events of the past 24 hours settle in his mind. He hadn't planned on stepping into a fight that night. He hadn't planned on changing anyone's life. But sometimes the right thing wasn't about planning. It was about acting in the moment, standing up for what was right. And as the road stretched ahead of him, Chuck knew one thing for sure. Strength wasn't just about the ability to fight. It was about knowing when to step in, when to help, and when to walk away, knowing you'd made a difference. The memory of Eli's small, uncertain but hopeful smile stayed with him as he drove into the horizon, the echoes of the night fading behind him. And that's how one moment of courage can change everything. Sometimes, standing up for what's right doesn't take superpowers, just the strength to act when it matters most. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Stay tuned for more powerful stories.